In his farewell address to the nation, George Washington said of political parties, quote, "They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion." Washington's words were in the context of the emerging conflicts between the Federalists, largely led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Federalists, who had become the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. As you could probably guess from the names, the main division was about if more power needed to reside with the federal government, or if too much power in the federal government would lead to tyranny. The War of 1812 exposed the need for a powerful federal military when the British were able to burn Washington, D.C. to the ground in August of 1814. But somewhat ironically, because Federalist leaders had floated the idea of northern states seceding from the Union so they could negotiate a separate treaty with Britain, the Federalist Party became viewed as disloyal to the Union and largely collapsed as a viable opposition party. The Federalist Party was only able to field one more presidential candidate after the war, Rufus King, who lost in a landslide to Democratic Republican James Monroe in 1816. During Monroe's 8 years in office, the Democratic Republican Party completely dominated national politics, albeit with notable inter-party squabbles. Monroe ran more or less unopposed in 1820, but he followed Washington's tradition of not running for a third term. This meant that during the 1824 presidential election, a Democratic Republican was going to win, and there were four serious candidates to choose from. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who was also the son of former President John Adams, former Speaker of the House Henry Clay, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, and former Tennessee Senator and war hero Andrew Jackson. Adams had strong support in New England, Clay and Jackson were popular in the West, and Jackson and Crawford were fighting for the votes in the South. No candidate was able to win the majority, meaning the election would go to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay had hoped that he would be able to use his influence as former Speaker to win. But losses in New York and Louisiana meant Clay had finished in fourth place overall, and only the top three candidates were available for the House vote. Still, this did leave him in a position where his support would likely choose the eventual winner. This was not an easy choice for Clay, as most believed he disliked all three options, each for different reasons. Clay was known to have a rocky personal and professional relationship with Adams, going back to working together on a peace treaty negotiations during the War of 1812, and worsening when Adams had been selected as Secretary of State over him by Monroe. Crawford recently had had a stroke, and his health was a serious concern. And Clay had been wary of Andrew Jackson ever since Jackson led an invasion of Florida in 1819. In a speech before Congress condemning the military action and Jackson personally, he said, quote, "Remember that Greece had her Alexander, Rome her Caesar, England her Cromwell, France her Bonaparte, and that if we would escape the rock on which they split, we must avoid their errors." In the end, Clay decided to support Adams. If this was part of an agreement so that Clay could eventually become Secretary of State is disputed by historians, but for Andrew Jackson there was no question in his mind that a corrupt bargain was made. From this, the Democratic-Republican Party split, and new parties began to emerge. All political parties are, at core, groups of people trying to win elections. To win elections, you have to get more votes than your opponent, and because of this, parties tend to focus on issues that allow their candidates to contrast with opponents on issues that will get more voters. As old conflicts settle, new conflicts emerge around new issues, and in this moment, America was now beginning to confront one of the major conflicts of the 1800s, the growing divide between industrial and agrarian interests. Within the Democratic-Republican Party, this new fault line matched the new rivalry. Supporters of Andrew Jackson tended to be aligned with agrarian views, where wealth and prosperity were tied to land ownership. And placing so much value on land, these voters quickly latched onto the idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the belief that America should expand, specifically expand west until it touched both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But of course, this land was occupied by Native Americans and claimed by European powers such as the Spanish, meaning this path would lead to war. These military expansionist positions, advocated by Jacksonians, were more or less the exact concerns Clay expressed about Jackson in his speech to the House years before. Northern industrialists didn't need more land, they needed more customers. So wars with European powers like Spain would be bad for business. But it didn't mean that it wasn't popular with voters. Jackson and his supporters also advocated expanding voting rights to all white men rather than just white male property owners. They argued this was about fairness, but it wasn't a coincidence that most of the new voters, many of them were recent immigrants, would likely vote for a party that advocated Western expansion using federal powers to acquire new land. Northern industrialists sought financial investment. They supported the national banking system and paper currency, both of which they valued as part of the industrial expansion and infrastructure projects. But banks were unpopular with farmers facing foreclosure, and this became another political wedge issue. Jackson's supporters painted John Quincy Adams and his party as the establishment and tried to sell the Scotch-Irish Andrew Jackson as an outsider deeply connected to the plight of the common man. The reality was Jackson was no political novice. He had been the first congressperson from Tennessee in 1796 and was a senator back when George Washington was president. He was quite wealthy, owning over 100 slaves and one of the largest cotton plantations in Tennessee. And despite myths about Jackson's intelligence, not only wasn't he illiterate, he literally taught reading and writing for a time. He passed the North Carolina bar exam in 1787 at the age of 20, and he was appointed as a judge in the Tennessee Superior Court just 11 years later in 1798. Jackson was a wealthy politician, but he wasn't from a political family. His father was born in Ireland and died in a logging accident 3 weeks before he was born. And at the age of 14, his mother died while treating soldiers in the Revolutionary War, leaving him an orphan. And this narrative helped him to connect with a growing immigrant population that would eventually become a core coalition of the Democratic Party. Before the 1828 presidential election, the Democratic-Republican Party had formally split, with Jackson forming the Democratic Party and incumbent John Quincy Adams running as a national Republican. Adams, who had already lost the South in his prior campaign, had created a series of protective tariffs to help industrial interests that hurt Southern planters. They called those the Tariffs of Abominations, and so disliked was Adams in the South that his Vice President John Calhoun switched to join Jackson's ticket, although he declined to join the Democratic Party. The campaign was full of mudslinging from both sides. Jackson had married his wife before her divorce had been finalized, forcing him to remarry her to make the marriage legal. As a result, an Adams supporter wrote in an editorial, "Ought convicted adulteress and her paramour husband to be placed at the highest offices of this free Christian land?" Handbills were also printed attacking Jackson for his execution of 6 militiamen for desertion during his military career. Jackson's camp responded by accusing Adams of hiring a prostitute to work for him as a maid while he was serving as a diplomat in Russia, and took to calling Adams, quote, "the Tsar's pimp." In the end, Jackson won with 55.4% of the vote, carrying 15 states to Adams' 9. And Jackson's supporters also won a majority in the House and Senate. Jackson used his control of Congress to push through the Indian Removal Act, which gave the president the power to seize land owned by Native Americans in exchange for land west of the Mississippi. Even after centuries of war and disease, when Jackson took office, approximately 100,000 Native Americans still lived east of the Mississippi River. Of those, about 60,000 were from 5 nations that were called, quote, the 5 civilized tribes. These were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, who were also called the Creek, and the Seminole nations. These nations had negotiated treaties with the federal government and by law owned huge areas of land throughout the Deep South. Also by law, these were independent nations who would engage in diplomatic relations with the federal government like any other country. Much of the land they owned was not only already under cultivation, but prosperous. For example, John Ross, chief of the Cherokee, owned a tobacco plantation and had functionally founded the city that would become Chattanooga. His warehouse and trading post on the Tennessee River included a ferry service to facilitate trade. Ross had actually served under Jackson during the War of 1812. He owned slaves, and according to some accounts, he was as fluent in English as he was in Cherokee, if not more so. But none of that mattered because he wasn't white. The federal government used its power to remove him so his land would go to white settlers. All of this taken land would then become part of the United States, meaning that in addition to losing land rights, those who decided to stay would also have no citizenship rights, again because they weren't white. The land exchange was mainly in what is now modern-day Oklahoma. It was not only inferior in quality, but in many places still occupied by other Native American nations who were hostile to anyone attempting to settle on their land. The first removed were the Choctaw Nation, who lived in what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Their chief, George W. Harkins, wrote, "We as Choctaw rather choose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation." 15,000 Choctaw decided to move, bringing with them approximately 1,000 slaves. Nearly 2,500 died along the way, on what became known as the Trail of Tears. French author Alexis de Tocqueville witnessed a group of Choctaw being moved and wrote, "In the whole scene there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil but somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English and of whom I asked why the Choctaw were leaving their country. 'To be free,' he answered. Could never get any other reason out of him." Between 5,000 and 6,000 Choctaw refused to leave, but with few legal rights they were constant victims of legal fights and harassments. As one member put it in 1849, "We have had our habitations torn down and burned, our fences destroyed, cattle turned into our fields, and we ourselves have been scourged, manacled, fettered, and otherwise personally abused, until by such treatment some of our best men have died. Much of the Seminole Nation refused to leave. Decades of war ensued, resulting in thousands of deaths on both sides, as the Seminoles were pushed further and further away from their traditional lands in the Florida Panhandle and into the swamps of central Florida, until only small pockets remained. A group of Cherokee led by a man by the name of Major Ridge signed the treaty with the federal government that agreed to cede Cherokee lands in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina for land in what is now present-day Texas and Oklahoma. They did so against the wishes of the chief of the Cherokee Nation, the previously mentioned John Ross. Ridge and his supporters were not acting maliciously, but believed relocation was inevitable, and the terms would only worsen over time. Chief Ross and the Cherokee National Council argued the document was illegitimate, but Congress still ratified the treaty by a margin of a single vote. Approximately 16,000 Cherokee and between 1,000 to 2,000 slaves took to the Trail of Tears, and an estimated 4,000 Cherokee died along the way, with few records being kept regarding the slaves, who presumably suffered just as much if not more. Some of the Muskogee attempted to fight the move, but approximately 15,000 members were driven out of Georgia, eventually across the Mississippi into Oklahoma, with around 3,500 dying along the way. The Chickasaw were one of the last to be forced to relocate. They were able to sell some of their land rather than exchange it, using the money to purchase land from the already relocated Choctaw, but the $3 million they negotiated from the federal government went unpaid for nearly 30 years. Of the 3,000 who relocated across the Mississippi, between 500 and 800 died on the Trail of Tears. By the time Jackson ran for re-election in 1832, the party system had fractured to the point that 4 separate candidates on the ballot were able to win states. The anti-Masonic Party, running candidate William Wirt, won the state of Vermont on a platform opposing the Freemasons and advocating for protective tariffs and large-scale federal infrastructure projects. Former Vice President John Calhoun started the Nullifier Party in South Carolina on a platform of slavery and the state's right to choose to nullify any federal law they disagreed with. Their candidate John Floyd was able to win South Carolina. Jackson's largest national competitor was his old rival Henry Clay, who ran as the national Republican candidate. He won just 6 states and 49 electoral votes. Jackson got 54.2% of the vote, carried 16 states, and his 219 electoral votes was more than 4 times his closest rival. Jackson declined to run again in 1836, making room for his vice president, Martin Van Buren of New York. Opposition to the Democratic Party consolidated to form the Whig Party. Whigs believed that Jackson had overreached and abused executive power during his administration, but Whigs' cohesion was more around opposition than agreement. Whigs had not sufficiently organized to hold a national convention to agree on a single candidate, and instead held separate state conventions that selected regional candidates. The Whigs fielded 4 different candidates, each running in a different part of the country: William Henry Harrison, Hugh White, Daniel Webster, and Willie Magnum. The Whigs' plan was to game the system by having each of the regional candidates win enough electoral college votes to deny Van Buren an outright victory, therefore sending the decision to the House of Representatives, where they hoped to win enough seats that they could choose the winner. But the plan failed. Van Buren was just barely able to win the popular vote, getting only 50.8%, but he was able to win the Electoral College in a landslide with 107 electoral votes. His next closest competitor only had 79, but his being a northerner exposed a weakness. Van Buren lost Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina to slave-owning Whig candidates Hugh White and Willie Magnum. This was the start of a north-south divide within the party that would only grow. Shortly after Van Buren took office, the country fell into a deep recession bordering on a depression, started by what is now referred to as the Panic of 1837. Nearly 40% of all banks failed, and in the South, cotton prices fell almost 25%. When Van Buren ran for re-election in 1840, the Whigs were more organized. They ran William Henry Harrison, whose credentials of owning slaves and fighting a war against Native Americans blunted the Democratic base of support in the South, and the Whigs promised to save the economy by re-establishing the National Bank, which was popular with Northern industrialists. As a result, Harrison was able to win 52.9% of the vote and 234 electoral college votes to just 60 for Van Buren, beating him in the North and the South. Only in the West were the Democrats still the overwhelming choice, as they supported westward expansion through Manifest Destiny. The Whigs also took control of both the House and the Senate, and were ready to push forward their agenda. But unfortunately for the Whigs, Harrison died just a month into the presidency. Most people at the time believed Harrison caught a cold standing out in the rain during the inauguration, but more recent scholars think that he may have caught a variation of typhoid because the White House water supply was at the time downstream from public sewage. Whatever the cause of death, with Harrison dead, the powers of the presidency now fell to the vice president, John Tyler. It was initially unclear if Harrison's death meant that Tyler would now become the president, or if the vice president's job was simply acting as the president until a new election could be held. The text of the Constitution said the vice president would take over the, quote, powers and duties of the said office in the event of a president's death, but it wasn't clear if he would serve out the term. After consultation with Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, it was agreed that if he took the oath of office, he would become president following a joint resolution of Congress and complete the term. Tyler had been a Jacksonian Democrat until 1834, when he split with Jackson over what he viewed as Jackson's abuses of federal power. He wasn't loyal to the Whigs or their policies, and joined them more in opposition to their opponents than in any alliance with any of their beliefs. Almost immediately, conflicts emerged with his party. Tyler opposed the national infrastructure projects and vetoed two Whig proposals regarding reinstating the National Bank. As a result, all but one of his cabinet members resigned in protest in 1841. When he tried to replace them, Tyler became the first president to have any of his cabinet suggestions rejected by the Senate, which again was controlled by his own party. 4 times during his term in office, Tyler was unable to fill cabinet positions with his first choice, and his Treasury appointment, Caleb Cushing, was rejected 3 times in one day. Tyler also supported westward expansion and the expansion of slavery in the new Western territories, both being positions most of the Whig Party opposed. Because of all of this, the first impeachment proceedings ever were introduced against Tyler, again by his own party, but his enemies never had enough votes to impeach. Tyler was not nominated to run for re-election by either party. He tried to form a third party called the Democratic Republicans, also known as the Tyler Democratic Party, but when it was clear he couldn't win, he just gave his support to the Democrats. Van Buren sought the Democratic Party nomination again in 1844, but his views were no longer aligned with the Democratic Party he had helped create. He opposed the annexation of Texas, and he wasn't trusted by Southerners on the issue of slavery. The party instead chose James Polk, who ran on the idea of manifest destiny and more specifically on the annexation of Texas and Oregon. And unlike Van Buren, he was a Southerner and a slave owner. Any hope Van Buren had was crushed when Polk was endorsed by Andrew Jackson himself. The Whigs ran Andrew Jackson's old rival, Henry Clay, and a new abolitionist party calling themselves the Liberty Party also fielded the candidate James G. Birney, who received 2.3% of the vote. In the popular vote, the difference between Polk and Henry Clay was just 39,000 votes. The Liberty Party's 62,000 votes may have been part of the margin that moved a few states, but it's unlikely they're the actual spoilers that would have overcome the Electoral College margin of 170 for Polk and 105 for Clay. When Polk took office, he kept his promise to annex Texas and acquired California in the process by winning the Mexican-American War. He negotiated with the British to acquire the Oregon Territory at the 49th parallel, achieving the goal of manifest destiny to expand the Pacific. Polk had also ran on the promise of serving only a single term and kept that promise, leaving the election of 1848 wide open. The Democratic Party convention had infighting brought on by a group that called themselves the Barn Burners. The Barn Burners were named after a Dutch folk tale of a farmer who burned down his own barn to get rid of a rat infestation. They opposed all form of public debt, and being primarily northern-based, generally opposed the expansion of slavery. They eventually walked out of the convention in protest, but the party nominated Lewis Cass of Michigan. The Whig Party nominated Mexican war hero Zachary Taylor. Taylor had no prior political experience, and it was unclear if he even supported any of the Whigs' values. The recently formed Native American Party also joined in support of Taylor and the Whigs. Despite the name, they had nothing to do with actual Native Americans, but were rather a party formed against immigration, particularly Catholic immigration that had been growing since the start of the Irish famine in 1845. The Barn Burners, led by Martin Van Buren, established a third party calling themselves the Free Soil Party. Their main issue was opposition to the expansion of slavery in the new Western territories as they became states. The Free Soil Party won about 10% of the vote, and crucially won 26% of the vote in what had been previously a Democratic stronghold of New York State. The loss of New York and its 36 electoral votes swung the election to Taylor. After he took office, despite being a slave owner himself, Taylor angered Southerners when he discouraged the additional spread of slavery in the new territories, even going so far as to suggest that if a bill came to his desk banning slavery in the federal territorial land, he would sign it. Just 18 months into his presidency, Taylor fell ill with a stomach ailment at a 4th of July fundraiser. Just 5 days later, on July 9th, he was dead. Rumors circulated of assassination plots by pro-slavery groups or Catholics because of his anti-immigration positions, but no evidence one way or the other was ever found. But once again, an elected Whig president was dead. Vice President Millard Fillmore assumed office and removed all of Taylor's cabinet appointments and changed course on his plan for slavery in the new territories. Working with Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas, they worked out the Compromise of 1850, which granted California statehood as a free state and Texas as a slave state. It banned the slave trade but not slavery in Washington, D.C., and it strengthened interstate slave laws with the Fugitive Slave Act. Fillmore's signing of the Fugitive Slave Act was very unpopular in the North, and after much party infighting, the Whigs were not able to run him again and instead ran Winfield Scott, who was known to oppose slavery. The Democrats selected Franklin Pierce. Although Pierce opposed slavery on moral grounds, he also said, quote, "One thing must be perfectly apparent to every intelligent man. This abolition movement must be crushed or there is an end to the Union." Pierce won 50% of the vote in 27 states, with 254 electoral votes, to Scott's 43.9% in just 4 states and 42 electoral votes. Pierce sought compromise both within his own party and across the country, but largely achieved the opposite. He advocated for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which created the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but functionally broke the Missouri Compromise on slavery by leaving the decision of slavery up to a local vote under a proposal called popular sovereignty. This led to armed conflicts when pro- and anti-slavery supporters rushed into the new territories and engaged in armed conflicts for control, leading to a conflict we now know as Bleeding Kansas. In Congress, a Free Soil senator by the name of Charles Sumner from Massachusetts had given a number of anti-slavery speeches on the floor and was preparing another when South Carolina Democratic Congressman Preston Brooks walked up to him while he was sitting at his desk writing. He reportedly said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." As Sumner began to rise out of his chair, Brooks proceeded to beat him with his cane to the point of unconsciousness. While Brooks was administering the beating, another South Carolina Democratic congressman by the name of Lawrence M. Kite stood guard, brandishing his pistol at other congressmen who attempted to help Sumner, shouting, "Let them alone, goddamn you, let them alone." During the beating, Brooks' cane snapped, but he continued the beating with the remaining top of the cane using a large golden handle. Several Southern Democratic lawmakers made rings out of the pieces of the broken cane that were recovered from the Senate floor and wore them as neck chains in support. All of this lost Pierce any hope of support in the North, and so he was not selected to run again by the party. The Whig Party had dissolved for all intents and purposes following the loss in 1852, and two new rivals emerged to challenge the Democratic Party, the Know-Nothings and the Republican Party. The Know-Nothings were largely built around an anti-immigration platform, specifically targeting the Catholics who'd been coming from Ireland and Germany over the last decade that tended to vote for the Democratic Party. They nominated former Whig President Millard Fillmore. The Republican Party had just formed 2 years prior, largely around opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and was led by John Fremont. Their platform was largely around opposition to the expansion of slavery. The Democratic Party was divided into the Northern faction, which advocated for each new state to decide their own path regarding slavery, and the Southern Democrats, who advocated for the expansion of slavery in all territories. In fact, many Southern leaders wanted manifest destiny to continue to expand and to annex Cuba. The Democratic Party nominated James Buchanan, one of the few party leaders who'd managed to stay out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act controversy by being overseas as ambassador to Britain at the time. All three parties were able to find some support in different areas of the North, but the Republicans had almost no support in the South. The Know-Nothings got 21.5% of the votes, but that only led to victory in one state, Maryland. The Republicans won 33% of the vote and 115 electoral votes, but still finished second to Buchanan's 45.3% and 174 electoral votes. Shortly before his inauguration, Buchanan was leaked the outcome of the Dred Scott decision. He said in his address to the issue of slavery that, quote, "It is a judicial question, which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court of the United States, before whom it is now pending, and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally settled." But decided is not the same as settled. Just 2 days into Buchanan's term, the Dred Scott decision was released, and it asserted that Congress had no power to exclude slavery in the territories. Many quickly realized the president had been tipped off to the ruling, and additionally many suspected he had inappropriately influenced the decision. As a result, Northern support for Buchanan disappeared almost immediately, as much of the ruling held that the Northern states had no rights against the proposed federal slave codes that Buchanan advocated for. Before the midterm, the North was hit by an economic panic that led to the collapse of around 1,400 banks and thousands of businesses. Buchanan responded that he was, quote, "without the power to extend relief." The Republican Party gained a large number of seats in the midterms, and it was becoming more and more clear that the Democratic Party had really lost any chance of winning elections in the North. Southern Democrats knew that without Northern states they couldn't win national elections, and if the Republicans were able to take control of the federal government, all of the recent decisions regarding the use of federal power to protect the institution of slavery could be undone. John Brown's uprising in 1859 further stoked Southern fear around what would happen if they lost power. Rather than calm concerns, Buchanan stoked these fears by describing the event as, quote, "open war by the North to abolish slavery in the South." Buchanan kept his promise to run for only a single term, leaving the election of 1860 wide open. The Democratic Party could not agree on a candidate. While they all supported slavery, Southern Democrats wanted federal state slave codes that would force Northern states to enforce things like the Fugitive Slave Act and wanted to add to their platform expansion into Cuba. As a result, the Democratic Party fielded two candidates, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was supported by Northern Democrats and had the official party backing, and John Breckinridge of Kentucky, who ran as a Southern Democrat on a platform that included the federal slave code and the acquisition of Cuba. A group of former Whigs had formed a Unionist party after the Compromise of 1850 to try to find a middle ground to avoid conflict between the North and South. They selected John Bell as their candidate, and the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's stated position on slavery was actually more moderate than most Republicans, with him not calling for abolition, but seeking to stop expansion into the new states and territories. He gave a speech in the run-up to the party convention where he stated, quote, "This is all Republicans ask, all Republicans desire in relation to slavery. As those fathers marked it, so let it again marked, as an evil not to be extended, but to be tolerated and protected only because of, and so far as actual pretense amongst us makes that toleration and protection a necessity. Let all the guarantees those fathers gave it be, not grudgingly, but fully and fairly maintained. For this Republicans contend, with this, so far as I know or believe, they will be content. All 4 of these candidates were able to win at least one state. Unionist John Bell won 12% of the popular vote in the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, all border states seeking to avoid the secession crisis. This got him 39 electoral college votes. Democratic candidate Stephen Douglas won 29.5% of the vote, second highest among all candidates, but only one state, Missouri, leaving with only 12 electoral votes. The Southern Democratic candidate John Breckinridge received only 18% of the vote, which left him third overall, but won 11 Southern states, netting him 72 electoral votes, and second place overall. But the winner was Abraham Lincoln, who won 39.8% of the vote and carried 18 states, winning 180 electoral college votes. But before Lincoln could even take office, 7 Confederate states declared secession from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis president. In his inaugural address, Lincoln specifically stated that he had, quote, no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. But Southern Democratic leaders made clear in their writings that it wasn't just about being able to maintain slavery in the Southern states. They wanted to expand slavery into the new territories and even beyond by turning Manifest Destiny south toward Cuba. They weren't just interested in maintaining slavery, they wanted to expand it and to force non-slave states to accept federal slave codes. They were willing to go to war with the Union, as they had with Mexico, to further their dreams of Manifest Destiny on behalf of white supremacy. But war with the Union was not the same as war with Mexico. Southern dreams of expansion faded to thin hopes of war of attrition. For the election of 1864, the remaining Northern Democrats nominated General George McClellan, the first commander of the Union forces whom Lincoln had relieved of command in 1862 for failing to pursue Lee after the Battle of Antietam. McClellan personally campaigned on continuing the war, but the party platform stated a, quote, demand that immediate efforts be made for a cessation of hostilities. Lincoln's Republicans joined with some of the Northern Democrats who supported the war under the National Union Party, swapping out first-term Vice President Hannibal Hamlin for Southern Governor Andrew Johnson, likely to help them win over the border state support. Although there was a great deal of concern that Lincoln might lose, Lincoln won 55.1% of the vote, 22 states and 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 44.9, and only 3 states with just 21 electoral votes. Just 6 months after the election, the war was over when Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. But Lincoln was shot and killed only a few days later. Before the war, Vice President Andrew Johnson was both a Southern Democrat and a slave owner. He had unsuccessfully tried to convince Southern leaders to stay in the Union, arguing that they would still have a majority in the Senate they could use to fight Lincoln, but he was the only one who stayed in the Senate from the South. Johnson granted mass pardons of Confederates, and as a result, the now pardoned Confederate leaders began winning local elections in the South and passing black codes that restricted basic rights for freed blacks, to the point that in some places they could not buy property or even move freely through public spaces. When he vetoed the civil rights legislation intended to provide freed blacks voting rights and protections from violence, his veto was overridden, and his ongoing refusal to enforce laws and attempts to fire cabinet members who opposed him led to him being the first president to be impeached, although not removed. Having completely alienated the Republicans, Johnson tried to run on the Democratic ticket in 1868, but they instead selected Horatio Seymour. The first 2 planks of the Democratic platform were granting the Southern states full restoration to the Union and general amnesty for, quote, all past political offenses. Union General Ulysses S. Grant ran on the Republican ticket, winning 26 of the 34 eligible states and 214 electoral votes to Seymour's just 80, but the popular vote was far closer at 52% to 47%. In 1872, Democrats accepted they couldn't beat Grant with so many states still not reinstated due to the ongoing Klan violence. They threw their support behind Horace Greeley, who had split off from the Republican Party in hopes his winning might bring an end to Reconstruction, but Grant won every single eligible state in a landslide. But then everything changed with Cruikshank versus United States in 1875. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not prosecute white supremacist paramilitary organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan as they used violence against black voters. As a result, during the 1876 election, in several states, violence and fraud ran rampant. In South Carolina, for example, a reported 101% of eligible voters had votes counted. In terms of violence, the lowest estimate was that at least 150 black Republicans were murdered in Louisiana alone. Louisiana and Florida were both contested with 2 sets of electors claiming victory. Although the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden had won most of the southern states and the popular vote over Rutherford B. Hayes, the Electoral College came down to a single vote. The electoral vote margin was so close that in Oregon, the state's Democratic governor attempted to disqualify a Republican Electoral College voter and replace him with a Democratic elector by arguing that him being a former postmaster made him ineligible based on a technicality. After an electoral commission investigated the fraud, a compromise was offered by the Democratic side. They would concede this election in exchange for the removal of federal troops from the South. If freed blacks in the South were not going to be able to vote because the Supreme Court had prevented the federal government from protecting them from the groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they were not going to be able to help the Republican Party win elections, and political parties only exist to win elections. So Hayes and the Republicans agreed to the terms, functionally ending black voting rights in the South. Thanks to Jim Crow laws, for the next 52 years, every single Democratic presidential candidate won every Confederate state but one, usually by huge margins, even in elections where they lost every other part of the country. It wasn't until 1828 that Herbert Hoover was able to win Texas, Florida, Virginia, and Tennessee in his landslide victory over Al Smith. Smith was a Northerner, a Catholic, opposed to Prohibition, and marred by the Tammany Hall scandal. The Republicans were riding high on a wave of economic prosperity through the 1920s, which Hoover, as Commerce Secretary, could claim credit for. Other than the Catholic strongholds of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the only states Smith won were still in the Deep South. But within this landslide loss, the seed of the future urban base of the Democratic Party began to emerge, as although Smith had lost nearly everywhere else, he was the first candidate to win a majority of the 12 largest cities in the country. After 12 consecutive years of the Republican Party having control of the White House, House, and the Senate, giving them full authority to implement conservative laissez-faire economic policies, the year after Hoover's win, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. And much like the praise for the Roaring Twenties brought the Republicans a landslide victory, the blame from the voters for the collapse also fell squarely upon them. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won 42 of the 48 states, with 57.4% of the vote and 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 39% and 59 electoral votes. When Roosevelt took office, the Democrats also took control of the House and Senate and had the power to pass what he called the New Deal. The New Deal was full of public works, housing, and loan programs, all with the intention of stimulating the economy. Southern Democrats fully embraced the New Deal, as it gave them new ways to use federal powers to help their supporters, as well as also giving the ability to increase segregation and racial discrimination. Black families were explicitly excluded from low-interest loan housing programs, and neighborhoods with, quote, inharmonious racial groups were marked as either red or yellow depending on the proportion of black residents. This came to be known as redlining. White-only suburban communities were created with federal loan programs, while interstate highways were specifically built across black communities, with the property owners given less money by eminent domain by their communities as they were labeled as, quote, in decline. Having few options, many were forced to move into segregated federal housing, which came to be known as the projects. To give an idea of how lasting these effects were, a study comparing cities that were appraised by the Homeowners Loan Corporation under the New Deal compared to cities that were not appraised. It showed that cities that were not appraised had similar racial segregation in 2010 as they had in 1930, but the cities that were appraised were still 16.4% more segregated over 80 years later in 2010. And although less explicit, New Deal jobs programs generally favored white applications, particularly for higher-paying jobs, and most jobs were segregated. For example, of the 10,000 Works Progress Administration supervisor jobs in the South, only 11 were black. But voting calculations for the Northern Democrats were starting to change. Black voters in the South were still restricted from being able to vote in meaningful numbers, but starting around 1910, the, quote, Great Migration to the North had begun, with large numbers of Southern black community moving to the northern urban industrial centers. As a result, blacks in these areas became a voting bloc, at least for Northern Democrats to consider. In 1934, both of the senators from New York, Robert Wagner and Edward Costigan, went as far as to draft anti-lynching laws. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt famously joined the NAACP and gave her vocal support to the anti-lynching bills, earning her death threats. But her husband refused to voice any support for the federal anti-lynching laws proposed, likely out of fear of alienating the South. Southern Democrats were so opposed that in 1935, Senator Richard Russell Jr. of Georgia led a 6-day filibuster that effectively killed the bill. But even with all of the racial bias, there were some positives to the black Americans in the New Deal. An estimated 45% of the black population received some sort of assistance from at least one New Deal program, and many of the new worker protections did expand to black workers as well as white ones. For many black voters, this half-full bowl offered by FDR in the New Deal was at least progress. When FDR ran for re-election in 1936, he won two-thirds of the black vote. This was only slightly higher than the 60% national support he received, but notably, this was the first time a Democratic candidate had ever gotten a majority of black voters. And this support was not unconditional. In 1941, FDR was in his third term in office. World War II was raging, but America had not yet entered the war. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, proposed and organized a civil rights march on Washington, promising more than 50,000 would attend. The marchers were demanding federal employment laws that prevented discrimination. A week before the march was scheduled, Roosevelt issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practice Committee, which banned discrimination on the war effort. Although this was a very limited change that didn't go nearly as far as the marchers wanted, they did agree to call off the march. In 1945, just a few months into his fourth term, Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman was able to continue the rest of his term. In 1946, he issued an executive order to look into the civil rights of the country. And as a result, Truman proposed civil rights legislation that included desegregation of the United States military and called for a constitutional amendment that outlawed poll taxes. This was unacceptable to some Southern Democratic leaders. When Truman ran for re-election, calling themselves Dixiecrats, they encouraged their supporters to vote for the Democratic governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. Thurmond was a lifelong Democrat who had actively supported the New Deal, even raising money for Roosevelt since his first campaign and attending Roosevelt's first inauguration. But on this issue, Truman had gone too far. Dixiecrats were able to make Thurmond and his running mate Fielding Wright the official Democratic candidates in the states of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Elsewhere, Thurmond was on the ballot as a third-party candidate, listed as the States' Rights Party in a nod to the lost cause Confederate narrative. Dixiecrats didn't believe they could win. In fact, going into the election, most observers assumed the Republican candidate would defeat Truman, but they hoped they'd be able to win enough electoral votes in the South to throw the outcome to the House, where they'd be able to force negotiators to either candidate to agree to their segregation demands for their votes. The Dixiecrats ended up winning 4 states where they were listed in the ballot as Democrats, but Truman shocked everyone by carrying 28 states, gaining 303 electoral college votes and 49.6% of the vote overall, winning decisively over Thomas Dewey. When Truman decided not to run again in 1952, the Democratic Party selected Adlai Stevenson, who picked segregationist John Sparkman as his running mate in the hopes of uniting the party. But against war hero Dwight Eisenhower, Stevenson was soundly beaten. In 1954, the Supreme Court brought racial issues to the forefront when Brown v. Board of Education overruled the separate but equal legal backbone of segregation laws in public school. But Eisenhower's indifference to enforcement was such that by the end of his second term, only about 6.5% of Southern black children actually attended integrated schools. Against a large number of rivals, John F. Kennedy was able to win the Democratic Party nomination for the 1960 race. Likely in an effort to keep the support of the Southern Democrats, he made the surprising choice of Senate Majority Leader and Southern Democrat Lyndon Johnson of Texas for his vice president. During the presidential campaign, Kennedy recognized the growing value of the black vote. When Martin Luther King was arrested in Georgia for taking part in a sit-in, Kennedy called the local authorities to advocate on his behalf, as well as speaking to King's father and wife. This earned him the endorsement of King's father and positive publicity in the black community. Nixon had been counting on getting around the same 40% of the black electorate as Eisenhower, but Kennedy actually ended up with 70% of the vote. This was more or less his margin of victory in New Jersey, South Carolina, Illinois, and Missouri, and although Kennedy only won 22 states to Nixon's 26, he was able to win the Electoral College vote 303 to 219, and the popular vote 49.7% to 49.6% in one of the closest presidential elections in history. But Kennedy's courting of the black vote did cause rumblings in the Solid South. In Alabama and Mississippi, electors refused to vote for Kennedy, instead selecting segregationist Senator from Virginia, Harry Byrd. But this didn't deter Kennedy. Once in office, Kennedy urged the passage of the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed poll taxes. In 1963, Kennedy leaned even further into civil rights reform, advocating desegregation, often in direct opposition to Southern Democratic leaders such as Alabama Governor George Wallace. When Wallace first took office in 1963 as the governor of Alabama, he stood on a gold star marking where Jefferson Davis had been sworn in as the president of the Confederacy. He said in his inaugural speech, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Wallace then famously went on to block the doorway at the University of Alabama in opposition to 2 black students being granted admission. When Kennedy gave a national address on civil rights, his approval rating rose to 62% overall, but it dropped to 44% in the South. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. making Southern Democrat Lyndon Johnson president. Johnson surprised many when 5 days later, while giving the first speech to a joint session of Congress to a national television audience, he said, quote, "No memorial, oration, or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long." The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, along with the amendment to the Constitution outlawing poll taxes, and with it went the Democratic hold on the, quote, solid South. In the 1964 election, Republicans elected Barry Goldwater to run against Johnson. Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act and the 24th Amendment, and made this fact a point of emphasis in his campaign. Former Dixiecrat presidential candidate Strom Thurmond and a number of other segregationists endorsed Goldwater and switched parties. When the New Deal policies gave federal powers to segregationists, they were for federal power. When it was used to provide civil rights to black people, they were against federal power. Goldwater lost in a landslide, but he was still able to win 6 states, his home state of Arizona, and the 4 states Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrats had won: Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Johnson famously commented on racist campaign signs he saw riding through the South while campaigning. Quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." Johnson didn't run again in 1968. Anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy, Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy, and Vice President Herbert Humphrey became the leading Democratic candidates. In June, Humphrey was in the lead, but appeared to be fading to Kennedy, as Kennedy had won California and seemed almost certain to win New York. But shortly after giving a victory speech in California, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. This all but guaranteed Humphrey the nomination, but it didn't unify Democratic support around him. Kennedy was seen as an alternative to continuing the unpopular Vietnam policies of Johnson, while Humphrey was seen as a continuation. Further splitting the Democratic coalition, George Wallace ran under the American Independent Party on more or less a pro-segregationist platform. He won Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, along with 13% of the national vote. Republican candidate Richard Nixon was able to take advantage of Democratic infighting and positioned himself as a moderate alternative. Despite only winning 43.4% of the vote, he was able to win 32 states and 301 electoral votes, bringing him the presidency. In 1970, a Nixon political strategist gave an interview to the New York Times where he stated, quote, "From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. But the Republicans would be short-sighted if they weaken enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with local Democrats." Nixon nominated to the Supreme Court G. Harold Carswell, but the nomination was blocked when a speech was found where Carswell had said in 1948, quote, "I am Southern by ancestry, birth, training, inclination, belief, and practice, and I believe that segregation of the races is proper and the only practical and correct way of life in our states. I have always so believed, and I shall so always act." While the nomination didn't proceed, it did garner Nixon's sympathy and support from pro-segregation Southern Democrats. For the 1972 presidential campaign, rather than running as a third-party candidate, George Wallace tried to win the Democratic primary nomination and was a legitimate contender, winning 23.5% of the vote in 6 states before he was shot in an assassination attempt while campaigning in Maryland, effectively ending his candidacy with him in 3rd place. The eventual winner, George McGovern, lost to Nixon in a landslide. Nixon won 79% of the Southern white vote, including 86% of the white vote in the Deep South, and CBS reported that Nixon had won former Wallace voters 3-1. Nixon, of course, was forced to resign in shame 2 years later in 1974, and so the 1976 presidential campaign was between Gerald Ford and the Democratic governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Carter was able to reclaim the South and the Republican Party for a cycle, but this was the last time a Democratic candidate won a majority of electoral votes in the former Confederate states. In the 1980 presidential election, Carter faced off against Ronald Reagan. On August 3, 1980, Reagan gave a speech at the Neshoba County Fair in rural Mississippi. The fairgrounds were near where 3 civil rights activists had been murdered in an event well known both locally and nationally as the Mississippi Burning Murders in 1964. During this speech, Reagan said, "I still believe the answer to any problems lies with the people. I believe in states' rights." Even Reagan's own staff conceded the optics were questionable, telling the Washington Post at the time they decided not to meet with a predominantly black Urban League organization prior because, quote, "It would have been like we were coming to Mississippi and we can get the folks there saying we didn't really mean to be talking to them Urban League folk." After Reagan's victory, in 1981, Reagan aide Lee Atwater gave an interview where he was asked about the Southern strategy. Although Atwater denied any racial pandering by Reagan, the interview asked a question, quote, "But the fact is, isn't it, that Reagan does get to the Wallace voter, to the racist side of the Wallace voter, by doing away with legal services, by cutting down on food stamps?" This was Atwater's response to that question.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying by 1968 you can't say that hurts you, it backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Not only was Atwater not fired or reprimanded for this response, he became the deputy campaign manager for Reagan's 1984 campaign, the campaign manager for George Bush's 1988 campaign, and the chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1989. History is awkward.